This is the story of a love affair between a nation and a fruit.
I think you've got a job to breed crocuses.
Do you? Why? What is it you like about the crocs?
Oh, they're sweet.
I like your pink lady look, actually.
A golden delicious, that's a golden delicious.
In Britain, we crunch our way through 50 billion apples a year. But our relationship with the apple goes beyond mere appetite. I want to find out what drove Victorian horticulturalists to lead the world, creating apples in every shape, size and colour, their characters as varied as we are.
How many gallons of cider will I earn tipping all these in here, Roger?
Ever I heard of working for Kine, you?
I want to uncover the ingenious and painstaking work of British scientists.
It's amazing that all the remnants of the research is still down here.
How did they help create the mass market apple we know today? And why did that leave our varieties in the shade? The apple once shaped our landscape. I want to find out how we have shaped the apple. This is virtually the dividing line between two great counties, Herefordshire off to the west, Worcestershire off to the east. It's a rolling, folded landscape of woodlands, orchards and pasture. This is home. It's where I grew up. As a boy, I roamed the fields, climbed the trees and scrubbed in the orchards. It's a place that, in a way, has shaped who I am. I'm a product of this landscape. But more than that, this is a landscape in which apples belong. And each one has a story to tell, whether it's been engineered by gardeners or whether it's one of those little accidents of nature. For centuries, the apple has captivated us. It's a tricky fruit to cultivate because the apple is promiscuous by design. Left to its own devices, its offspring are as unpredictable as ours. Imagine the frustration of those early horticulturalists thousands of years ago, stumbling across an apple. It was the perfect fast food. And yet, when they sowed the seed, what came up wasn't the same. In fact, it was just as likely to be sour and inedible as it was to taste good. The mother tree gives birth to thousands of pips contained within the fruit, and every single pip is genetically different. And just like children, most grow up to be ordinary. But once in a while, an apple with the most delicious taste and texture is born. When you sow the pips, you don't get the original form. That's to say, if you sow a Bramley seed, you won't get a Bramley, or if you sow a Braben, it won't be a Braben that grows, or a Cox or a Worcester, or any of them for that matter. Apples require pollinators. That's to say, the pollen from one plant needs to be transferred across into the flower of another, and that crossing of pollen brings with it the most wonderful genetic exchange. Apples generally have 34 chromosomes, and that means that you get 17 characteristics from one parent and 17 sets of characteristics from the other. And that's part of the excitement of growing them. And this presented man with a real puzzle: how to persuade nature to reproduce exactly the same apple tree and fruit over and over again. And the solution we came up with was grafting, a method of cloning the original tree. The practice of grafting is thought to go back around 5,000 years, and to this day, every apple tree in commercial cultivation is grafted in exactly the same way. The principle behind grafting is delightfully straightforward, and in fact hasn't changed since the Romans played around with gluing one plant on top of another. Not apples, but in their case, probably grapes. And they realised that plants were able to fuse together for the very simple reason that on any plant there is a layer of growth immediately underneath the bark. That area of green is the cambium layer. That's where the cell division and the cell expansion is taking place. It's essentially the life of the plant. And if you can put two of those cambium layers together, then the plants fuse
and become one. First, you need a rootstock. This is a wild form which has been cultivated for a particular characteristics. It will essentially become the driving force behind the plant. It will govern how much nutrient is taken up. It's like the sort of engine of a car. And the principle is to cut the head off the rootstock. And then to take your scion. This is the particular variety of apple that you're after. It's taken from the parent plant, and it means that the genetic material contained within that scion is exactly the same as the parent. So any characteristics the parent have in terms of the flavour of the fruit, the ripeness of the fruit, the colour of the skin, are all contained within that piece of wood. And what we do is literally put that on top of there, and the two are then bound up with tape, and the rootstock fuses with the scion. And in fact, the genetic material of the rootstock remains in the rootstock. The genetic material of the scion remains in the scion. But what we end up with is a scion which is totally governed by the energy of the rootstock. And that's what gives us the particular vigour and height of the tree.
With the discovery of grafting, we could clone our favourite apple trees again and again. One of Britain's most prosperous and time-honoured apples was planted 200 years ago in a back garden in Nottinghamshire. Its clones have generated a £50 million industry.
The Bramley apple tree was grown from a pip by a young lady, Mary Ann Brailsford, between 1809 and 1815. It was thought it came from an apple grown on a tree at the bottom of her garden. One seedling produced very fine apples in 1837 when the new occupier was Mr. Matthew Bramley. Fantastic. Hi, how are you?
What a lovely day.
It's, well, you know, I've seen better days for looking at apple trees.
The Bramley tree's proud custodian is 90-year-old Nancy Harrison.
So you were born in this house, and
The tree was in the next
the tree was in the next door neighbour's garden.
Yes.
So
yeah.
you bought the house next door.
That's right.
To get
yes.
the tree.
Yes, I paid £500 for that.
What was it about that particular tree that really captured your imagination?
We've always loved it, really. We've never climbed it or anything. You know, nobody's been allowed to damage the Bramley at all, you know, except the cats.
And it's such a distinctive fruit in terms of how it tastes and how it behaves when it's cooked.
And the flavour from the Bramley, you know, freshly stewed Bramley, it's really unbelievably nice. And I've eaten it with custard, sausages, a steamed pudding, and bacon, beans and apple. And it goes marvellously with anything.
It's a garden typical of the cottages of this period. Long and narrow. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? It's like walking into an enchanted woodland. And you can see where the original has fallen. The original was planted here and has obviously been blown. And this a piece would originally have been up here. I would have branched away. And it says something for the resilience and the enthusiasm of the Bramley to grow again, that it's rooted where the boughs kiss the ground, it's gone away again. It's so vigorous, it's got so much energy that even being blown down by the wind won't prevent it. Certainly won't hold it back. You hear people talking about living history, and this really is living history. It's like standing next to a cathedral. This is a cathedral of horticulture. And by 1944, the fruit census of that year tells us that there were over 2 million Bramleys, all taken from this one tree. Every single Bramley you've ever eaten, every single Bramley tree that has ever been planted has come from this one.
Everybody loves the tree. It's a stout old thing, isn't it? And puts up with all weathers.
If there was someone in history that you think the Bramley might represent, who do you think it would be?
Winston Churchill.
Do you know, I think you're absolutely right. I was going to say Queen Victoria, but I think Winston Churchill is even better.
Yes, because he could cope with everything, couldn't he? And it's a wonderful old thing. I think it'll live forever.
Like the Bramley, the Cox, Britain's best-loved dessert apple, was a gift from nature's lottery. Cox's orange pippin was grown from a pip by horticultural hobbyist Richard Cox in the 1820s. It produced apples world-renowned for their intense and aromatic flavour. Sadly, the original Cox tree was blown down in a gale in 1911, but our appetite for its clones lives on. The Cox and Bramley may be our best-loved English apples, but since nature is constantly throwing up new varieties at will, there really can be hidden treasures in our hedgerows. On the A4260, apple lover Andy Howard believes he's found a real gem, and he's called it the Deddington Pippin.
Gosh, look how heavy this ladder is. It's here. This one here, yeah. You can see it's an old tree, by the thicknesses of the branches. It's growing right up trying to chase the light because it's in quite a shady position here. That's why most of the fruit you can see is just above us in the canopy because that's the most sunny part. There's a lot of dead wood in it. We've got to keep this old beauty going because it is a pippin tree, but it's got very good qualities. Someone in probably wanted an early motor car, would have been driving along here, threw a pip out, and like 70 years later this is what we've got. But it's got really key characteristics. Is that it's a really good storing apple. It stays on the tree until January, and it will then store into February and March, and it's a lovely, sweet, juicy apple.
Well, it's all going to be in the tasting.
Yeah, that is true, so
let's try one of the
get the ladder out and see what we can do. I've like blue pea to you, you've got to always come prepared. This is the fun bit, this. Let's just take this off first. That's it. Right, now just have to put the legs on. And just literally you want to try and...
Is that locked in, that one?
Yeah, hang on, let's just move it back a little bit. That's it.
Yeah?
Yeah. And you just literally want to get the thing underneath it and just try and twist it as best as you can. You can't say this in an action shot.
I need to be about 4 feet tall.
Keep twisting. Oh, there we go. He scored. You win the goldfish.
Okay.
Has a flavour of a bit of a Cox, but it does need a
It does.
Does have a flavour of a Cox, but it does need a couple more months to actually to ripen up. But that's one of the key things. Oh, well done. Excellent. Oh, nice red one there, Chris. There you go. Oh, wow. Great catch, that one. Yummy. Real flavour to it.
It's a real beauty.
It is a real beautiful tree.
The remarkable thing is that thousands of people must whistle past this spot every day without realising, firstly, just how special the apple is, but also how diverse the hedgerow is.
Yeah.
It's amazing what comes to light. It's what's so special about these. It's why I get so excited about these sorts of fruits, that they're existing without us. They don't need gardeners' help. They don't need tending and nurturing and loving care and hours of pruning. They're happy just doing their own thing.
This is nature's selection, though. It's still breeding a new variety, which is great. And this is nature saying, look, here is a great new variety. It ticks all the right boxes. If you can find me, here I am. So luckily, now and again, you do get somebody who comes along and finds it. So if anyone else is out there, if you do find a new apple tree, research it and see if it's one worth saving, because you could have the next new Coxes, orange or Bramleys as well. So.
It does rekindle that whole kind of hunter-gatherer spirit, doesn't it?
We've all got that in us. We are all nomads, really. We like to wander around and find our food, and we've got it here on tap, basically. So.
What are you doing to preserve this, to make sure that it doesn't fall out of cultivation?
Well, I'm now actually taking graft wood. Every year I'll get on the ladder with the thing and take some graft wood from the end of the tree. I'll get probably 10 or 15 Deddington pippins off there. So this isn't the only one now. There's quite a few little baby ones growing up as well, which I'm very proud of as well.
So the future's secure for it?
The future's secure at the moment, which is great.
And while nature has thrown up some wonderful varieties of apple, It's human nature to want to improve on it, to try and influence the flavour and texture of the apple that's produced. And it was the British who first discovered how to do it. It was all thanks to some ferocious Victorian one-upmanship. The gardens of the great stately homes were more than showpieces. They were expected to provide a magnificent array of the very best fruit for the table to delight and surprise. Head gardeners set about bending the apple to their will.
The art of manipulating trees is really extraordinary. And when you consider some of the massive orchard trees that a seed from this may well have grown into, as soon as you graft onto a very dwarf rootstock, one that is mean in the amount of information and the amount of energy it sends through into the graft wood, this is what happens. You can produce the most diminutive little specimen.
The man who changed the course of the apple's future was Thomas Andrew Knight, later president of the Royal Horticultural Society. He believed he could engineer an improved apple. To do it, he played the part of the bee, impregnating the flower of one variety with the selected pollen from another. After decades of patient trial and error, the first hybrid apples were born. What followed was a breeding frenzy. Head gardeners of every stately home producing new and wondrous breeds to dazzle and grace the tables of their masters.
What's always surprised me is the amount of pressure that those gardeners were under. In the Victorian period, it was cut and thrust stuff. I mean, you could lose your job for the merest mistake.
Well, that was the main motivator. It was the fear factor. And it's why head gardeners were always looking to be able to deliver something new, a novelty to the table. It was unique in the sense that it was probably the only time that a servant then was able to speak to his master as an equal. And probably sometimes the master had to acknowledge that the servant knew more than him. And, you know, if you wanted to keep him, then you rewarded him. But it was also professional pride to grow things and put them on the table out of season. We can grow quality apples in this country. We've got the climate for it, and the interest was there. And it's just happened that we got an apple for all tastes, for all occasions and all seasons. And when you can do something well, it encourages you to develop it, doesn't it?
Is that why we fell in love with it, do you think? Is that really what's behind the British obsession with the apple and why we hold it so dear? The fact that it was very generous in the way that it grew, and it was relatively easy to get the crosses, so there was great variety in the types. Is that what held our attention?
It caught the imagination of lots of nurserymen, and I think that's what drove them on. And when you look at the range, I mean, is it 2,500 recorded apples in this country altogether? And we grow a small, quantity of that, about 120 of them. It's this versatility. I think that's the one thing that really, sort of makes us want to grow it and grow more of them. I just think, if you look back in time, I mean, probably the longest fruit in cultivation has been the apple, going back thousands of years. And in some ways, it's travelled with man as man has developed, and he's developed the apple. I think, there is a relationship between the two. Yeah. And I just think it's one of those, it's just a unique relationship in many ways. The real discovery for me has been Laxton's Epicure. It's the best apple ever. It must have been the one that, Eve tempted Adam with. It's something about it.
At the hands of the Victorian gardeners, we once grew more varieties of apple than anywhere else in the world. They were so plentiful, you could have eaten a different one every day for more than 6 years.
Gardens like this are the result of not just the Victorians' obsession with perfecting the apple, but also the tremendous advances in technology, in cultivation, growing, training and breeding. It's really important to remember, however, that the fruits that come out of gardens like this were only really available to the privileged few. The masses weren't devoid of apples. They celebrated them in a different way.
The working man's apple was small, bitter and shaken off trees. You couldn't eat them, but you could drink them. Cider was like water. Farm workers were paid with it. Babies were even christened in it. Ciderland, as the West Country was known, was once an Eden of Kingston Black and Foxwhelp, Pig's Snout, Sheep's Nose, Slack McGirdle, Hangy Down and Yarlington Mill. Apples that dry the mouth if you eat them, but precious for their juice. Roger Wilkins' cider barn is like stepping back in time. His family have been milling for generations.
How many gallons of cider will I earn tipping all these in here, Roger?
Ever I heard of working for kind you?
That's not the spirit, Roger.
My grandfather learned me a lot of what I know, like he learned me how to make cider and blend it. And I was brought up to drink. Well, I've drunk cider ever since I was sort of 4 or 5 years old, look, and brought up on it, winged on it. Okay, Dad.
Roger grows 15 different varieties of cider apple in his orchard, and each one has a unique taste. These are chiselled Jersey, and they come straight from the ground to the press.
I better let you taste this, what you've just helped make.
Come on then.
Alcohol-free, that is. Pure apple juice.
Couldn't get more fresh, could
No,
you?
you try that. It's different than you buy in the shop.
That is packed, isn't it? That is delicious. That's why you fall in love with apple juice, isn't it? So when you taste it and you're looking for whether it's going to make a sweet or a dry cider, do you experience layers of flavour in the same way as you would with tasting a wine, for instance?
What I
So you get
made
different
this
levels?
morning were virtually a lot more bitter sweets in it. There now, just tasting that juice, there's some bitter sharps in with that as well.
Okay.
I can tell the difference.
Because you have sweet, bittersweet,
Yeah.
sharp,
sharps,
and then bitter sharp.
Yeah.
So 4 different categories.
Yeah.
And in terms of the number of varieties you put in, do you mix it together or do you have sets or do you
No,
want
I
a
just
regime?
let it. I mix it as we're making it as a rule, like different sorts, different varieties. I just mix it with bitter sweets, bitter sharps.
Right.
Like. I taste every pressing we put up, like, and I can tell roughly what that cider's going to be like by just tasting apple juice. I don't test nothing.
You're happy with that?
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
So do you think I'll get a job tipping apples?
There you are. So you won't stick the pressure.
You think?
You wouldn't live on the money.
I'm very cheap.
You are. Yeah.
I think having spent the day pressing juice, which eventually will go into cider, to fill these great big barrels, there's a real sense of a cycle. The orchard that springs into life in the early part of the year and fills the landscape full of colour and activity from insects and wildlife. And then the fruits fill during those summer months. They're harvested or gathered from the ground, squashed, pressed, and then preserved as cider. It's a beautifully simple system. But also coming and having a look at the cider and thinking about the subtlety of the taste that Roger is looking for from each of the different varieties, and he knows which variety is going to inject which flavour to create the perfect cider.
And that's when I really appreciate how important it is to preserve variety. In the 20th century, Britain was entering a new era of mass market. Already popular varieties like the Cox seemed like obvious candidates for large-scale commercial production. But there was a problem. Our Cox trees turned out to be temperamental and prone to disease. Often the apples were just too poor to sell.
The apple's fortunes had almost stagnated. It had been bred and reared by talented but largely amateur gardeners. And what it needed was a massive impetus to allow it to compete on a commercial level worldwide. And that impetus came in the shape of some dedicated scientists in the Garden of England.
Deep in the heart of Kent lies East Malling Research Station. To this day, a powerhouse of scientific research at the heart of the industry. Set up in 1913 with money from growers and the Board of Agriculture, it promised to tackle the problems blighting the orchards. With Ronald Hatton, a world-distinguished horticulturalist at the helm, scientists began scrutinising every last detail of the apple. They dug elaborate observation tunnels, determined to measure and record every aspect of the apple tree. Hatton's approach was meticulous, going to extraordinary lengths to reveal its secrets.
It's one of the more unusual places to come and work, isn't it?
Dr. Jim Quinlan, retired head of pomology, is opening up the root tunnel for the first time in 15 years.
It's amazing that all the remnants of the research is still down here.
Yes, it's some years since it was used.
And so behind each one of these screens would have been a tree outside that we would have been able to explore.
That's right, with a glass panel.
Amazing.
Plenty of cobwebs.
You can just about make out the way that the roots are just coming down the glass there. That perennial root there is starting to come down. And then you get all of the little subsidiaries coming off it. And you can almost make out the root hairs as well, just giving you that little sheen.
Yes.
It's fascinating to see the marks on the glass, recording the growth, presumably.
It looks like the daily growth of a particular root.
And so what was the process here? What specifically was being investigated?
Well, I think it was to some extent unknown until they started looking at the roots, but obviously looking at the growth of roots throughout the year, and then what happened to the root during the course of the season. So you could look at the browning of the root, the insects, fauna. You'd see them eating away at some of the cortex of the root, observing how the roots developed during the whole of the season.
Had anything like this been done before? Had any exploration been carried out in terms of the way roots grew?
Nothing like as ambitious as this.
What was driving that almost obsessive quest to find out more about the plants?
Well, earlier work, some of the researchers here had been actually digging up trees and very carefully labelling the exact position of the roots system so that able to reconstruct the root system once the tree is out of the ground. This was a logical progression then to actually look at the growing root.
It must have been a wonderful environment in which to work. The atmosphere down here, the fact that it was so pioneering and that nature is revealing its secrets right in front of you on a pane of glass here.
Yes.
And no one had ever seen this. I mean, this is the equivalent of exploring outer space.
Yes.
Scientists knew for mass production we had to have apple trees that were completely reliable, consistent and hardy. The major breakthrough came when they discovered that the secret lay in the part of the tree that had been long ignored, the rootstock.
Ronald Hatton realised the way to overcome this problem was to actually produce rootstocks which would have a known level of invigoration. In other words, you could predict what size the tree was going to be. So he selected out 16 different types. He propagated them vegetatively, so you got away from this seedling variation, and produced Morling 1 to 16. Tested them and found that there was a large range of vigour, so that you could then decide which rootstock you're going to use to produce a tree of the size you required.
Do you think that at any point anyone realised the significance of what was being done here?
I think it became pretty obvious early on. For example, the most widely grown rootstock now is M9, Morling 9, which was produced here by Hatton. A dwarf tree, which is very productive, fruit a good size. A grower could then plant these, as they do today, high-density plantings, and be fairly sure that they can manage those trees from the ground in terms of pruning and harvesting the tree, relative ease of application of pesticides. That was a major advancement.
It seems strange that in order to pioneer the range of rootstocks, that nobody thought to patent those rootstocks, because, well, you would have all been millionaires had that happened, because they have become so worldwide.
We couldn't have had a penny on each rootstock. Now, of course, there is breeding in rootstocks, and any rootstock which is produced in the last few years can be patented and produce an income for the breeder. But for the majority of East Morling rootstocks, no, that's not the case.
East Morling's crowning glory, the M9, was and is a roaring success. When word got out, demand surged and rootstocks were made freely available to anyone who asked. By 1933, over 1 million had been released and the knowledge had been exported across the world. What could have made East Morling's fortune in royalties and given British growers a world edge strengthened the roots of our competitors. It's hard to imagine. In fact, it's inconceivable that it would be possible to achieve such consistency in plants without rootstock development, particularly here, the M9. The reason that it became so popular and such a ubiquitous rootstock is because this small, rather modest section of root provides the secret to not only uniform orchards, but also to a very consistent crop. In fact, the scientists very quickly learned that the roots not only drive the top growth, the scion of the plant, and control its vigour, but more than that, it's to do with the nutrient uptake, the water, the way the roots penetrate the ground, its survivability in many different conditions. It's to do with the way in which the fruit is produced on a regular level, season after season. On very young plants, early cropping means early rewards and large, succulent fruits. The M9 encapsulated all of those characteristics. It was so successful, in fact, that at one time, the M9 and its derivatives were said to be the roots of over 95% of all apples grown in Europe. There was no limit to the scale of imagination in East Morling's experiments. Storage was another nut to crack. They tackled this by building an entire ship's hold inside the lab. There they discovered how to induce apples into a state of suspended animation, pushing the limits of shelf life. By the 1940s, apples could arrive from the far reaches of the empire, as if just plucked from the tree. And British consumers enjoyed apples all year round. With encouragement, the British orchard too began to thrive. Science breathed life into our orchards. Growers invested in grading machines, and English Coxes and Worcesters fought to hold their own in the mass market. The scientists at East Morling made the biggest contribution the industry had ever seen worldwide. But in post-war Britain, there was a new phenomenon, that of the supermarket, introducing a new set of consumer demands. How could we possibly resist the temptation of the exotic varieties like Jonathan and Macintosh that swept in from North America. The simple truth was that we in Britain had an industry that was working towards quality and quantity, but now the consumer turned round and said, "You're growing the wrong varieties." Scientists at East Malling went back to the drawing board, confident that science could engineer an apple for the new market. The main stud of the breeding programme was our old favourite, the Cox. They began a painstaking process, extracting pollen from one tree and dusting it onto the flowers of another, making tens of thousands of crosses. After decades of work, they unveiled the fruits of their labours.
This is suntan, very much a Cox type, late flowering, large fruit, but quite acid. It didn't make the impact that we thought it might. Not an improvement over Cox in many respects.
It's got many of the characteristics, hasn't it, in terms
It is.
of the fruit?
It's certainly
slightly more red, but
certainly a
the-
Cox
the-
type.
The striping, slight orange texture,
Yes.
quite an open
Yes.
flower. Can I try it?
Yes, certainly.
It's very similar.
Yes, oh yes.
So why was it not successful? Why was it not adopted as a replacement or an alternative?
Some problems over storage. It wasn't the leap forward we were looking for in terms of an improved Cox. Here we are. This is full stuff. Glad to say it's a nice crop and still hanging on to it.
It would have been disappointing if we'd have got here and it hadn't have produced
Yes.
anything. It's very Pink Lady-like, isn't it?
Yes, this is a red selection of Falstaff. Falstaff wasn't as highly coloured as this originally, but it's a good, tasty variety.
It's very sweet.
Yes.
Very sweet, very juicy. It's a very delicate flavour. Very similar to Pink Lady, actually, in terms of the way it
Bit more
delivers its
character,
flavour.
I think.
It does have a bit more character, a little bit more depth, but nowhere near as much depth as a Cox.
No.
It doesn't kind of assault the senses like a Cox does.
No.
It's a much more
It doesn't
subtle.
have the acid level, no.
No, I'd go with that. Don't think it replaces the Cox, to be honest, but... Alongside Suntan and Falstaff came a slew of others. But if our Victorian predecessors had bred for novelty, this was all about business, pest resistance, cropping, consistency. What was the process involved in producing those new varieties? How were the selections made, and how were those crosses made?
Well, you cross maybe two varieties, probably producing 10,000 seedlings, from which you've got to select the best. Well, initially you might screen them for resistance to mildew, for example. That can be done in the greenhouse. You reduce the numbers down to maybe 2,000. And it's a matter of screening out various characters which you don't want until you finally come to maybe 100. You plant these out in the orchard, then you've got to see how they crop, how the tree grows. Then you might select out one or two for further trialling. So at least 10 years, or probably longer, before you come up with a final variety which you name.
With all of the knowledge on the different varieties, on the character, and also having a very clear focus on what was required, why was it elusive? Why was this variety that would dominate the world going to remain an elusive art?
Perhaps you could say that a mistake might have been made in concentrating on Cox, because Cox is not a world variety. We should have been looking more widely at what was required in other countries, but we were focused very much on the requirements of the UK grower.
The fact that the best scientific brains at East Malling in the 70s and 80s couldn't produce a new variety to dominate the globe shouldn't really be seen as a failure. They set themselves an almost impossible task. In addition to all the issues of texture and taste, and colour and consistency, marketability,
They were looking for an apple that would be able to grow in all the orchards around the world, as far afield as New Zealand and America. However, the frustrating thing for them must have been that an apple which was found almost accidentally in America, then adopted by the French, and a fruit that was vacuous, almost overinflated, suddenly came into the fall.
This is what threatens their survival. The avalanche of French Golden Delicious pouring into Britain at a rate of more than 250,000 tonnes a year.
The Golden Delicious had been discovered growing wild in West Virginia back in the 1890s. It turned out to be the perfect modern commercial apple, dependable, hardy and cheap. And it flourished in French orchards.
And you know the most galling thing was? Because of the environmental conditions it required, we couldn't grow it here.
In the 1970s, the French launched a government-backed campaign to persuade us to eat it. And we did.
French Golden Delicious, Le Crunch.
The French had struck gold. By 1981, they had 240,000 acres of orchards, 4 times what we had. And we were crunching our way through more Golden Delicious than anything else. The bitter irony was that, in all likelihood, they were being grown on our old friend, the M9 rootstock.
The reason the Golden Delicious became just so popular is very simple. From a commercial perspective, it's a very consistent crop. Every one of these apples looks exactly the same, and that's true of just about every fruit off the tree. It's also a very heavy cropper, very reliable. It produces fruits year on year. It also can be picked early, stored and transported very easily. And from a consumer's perspective, well, it emerged at a time when consumers were told that consistency was all to do with quality. And who could resist a bank of apples that looked as handsome as that? Why do you think people went crazy for them, though? Was it just the fact they were available, or really?
And they were cheap.
Right.
But the cheapest apple in the world was a French Golden Delicious. I think that was working out about in the 80s, £2 for 40 pence.
I like the Golden Delicious because of the kids.
Okay.
That's their favourite.
Is it?
They like the soft texture of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
School lunch boxes. You know, that's what you got, mate, innit? You got your butties, you got your Kit Kat, and you got your apple.
Golden Delicious is undoubtedly one of the most important apples of the 20th century, both as a commercial variety in its own right and as the parent of apples like Gala and Pink Lady. But it's not to everyone's taste.
So tell me, why aren't you buying something like a Golden Delicious then? Because there's a great big pile of Golden Delicious on that stall over there. Yeah. Why aren't you tempted by those?
They're pale and insipid and they're French and they're tasteless. Well, what more can you say?
The plight of the British grower was made worse when we joined the common market. Our farmers couldn't compete with cheap imports like Golden Delicious, and overnight orchards became redundant. Growers began to grub them up, and with the orchards went the diversity of traditional English varieties. The scale of destruction was vast.
A land utilisation map from the 1930s gives some graphic idea of how much of Worcestershire would have been down to orchard. Standing on top of the hill here, looking due west across the heart of Worcestershire, the map shows between 20 and 30% of the land was down to orchard, shown here in pink with purple spots. Look out there today, and with the exception of a little clump of orchard trees over there, seeing right across towards Breedon Hill in the distance, there's not a single sign of a large-scale orchard. It gives you some idea of just how much of our orchard landscape has gone. In fact, since 1950, nationwide, it's estimated that 63% have been grubbed up. And that's a shame. It's such a distinctive style of looking after the landscape.
And it's the heart of communities like this, which has just been ripped to pieces.
Norfolk dumpling, blackjack, sops in wine, Beely pippin, ancient English varieties, all but lost to the hedgerows. I had a favourite apple when I was a boy. I've no idea what it was, but I wonder if that tree survived.
When we were kids, we used to cycle over, and there'd be certain orchards that we'd always be drawn to, the ones that had the best flavour. We knew exactly where to go. But there's one up here that I remember going to on a summer's afternoon, and there was one tree where the fruits were oversized, had rosy flesh, and the most fantastic flavour. It'd just be great to be able to find out what that apple was.
Hello?
Hello, hello. This is a very strange question. When I was about this high, I used to go scrumping in your orchard.
Did you?
And there's one apple, it's this one down here.
Yes, well, maybe it's still there because a lot of the trees are blown down, as you know, there's very few left, but you're welcome to look if that's what you would like to do.
Do you mind if I go and have a wander around?
No, certainly. Help yourself. Yeah.
There aren't many trees left. A handful. This would have been just a grand orchard. I mean, just fantastic. South-facing slope. Water would have percolated through the ground, the heavy clay soils. It would have been an absolute treat. And I remember it as being, in fact, it was so dense when we hopped over the gate just down there. We felt safe enough to be able to hop in and scrummage around without being seen from the house up there, or in fact, without being seen from anywhere. But that's how dense the canopy was.
I want to do my bit to preserve the English apple. Although worryingly, it looks more like a Golden Delicious than I remember. I hope it doesn't taste like one.
Oh, it's so juicy. Very clear, white, fresh. And just running with juice, look. Amazing. And it tastes a little bit like a Gala or Worcester. It's got a real purity, very delicate flavour. I wonder if this is it. It'd be amazing, wouldn't it?
A simple DNA test will tell me what it is.
An apple and a stalk and a few leaves. Hopefully, will help us to solve the mystery. What the mystery might be.
In Britain, we consume 50 billion apples a year. 70% are imported, coming from all over the world. So where are the English apples?
Tucked away in the corner. Look, you couldn't get much further out of the market. Tucked away in the corner is a little kind of jewel, a little pile of apples. The russet. You know, it's not the most glamorous looking thing, but it's the best tasting apple here.
It's not just the French squeezing the English apple out of the market.
Morning, Justin.
Very good morning, Chris.
How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. You all right?
What have you got here then?
You've got the Southern Hemisphere have just like basically finished with all their apples.
Okay.
Your Chile, South Africa, Argentina. All your South African like apples have all finished now. So you're moving over into the Northern Hemisphere. The French apples have just started now. You get a little bit of English kind of coming through.
What is kind of top spec apple? What makes an apple good for you to sell?
It's got to look the parts. It's got to be like crunchy. It's got to eat well. It's got to have no like little dinks or like, you know, it's got to be like 99.9% perfect. The grannies and the red chiefs are all polished and waxed. They look the beastness.
There's no doubt we love those buffed international beauties, but recently there's been a real yearning to buy British. So although we now have far fewer growers, a new breed of super orchard is taking root right in the heart of Kent. This is Mansfield's.
We farm just over 3,000 acres. new trees we've planted over the last 10 years is at over 1 million trees. All East Malling rootstock 9.
It is a very frustrating suggestion, I suppose, that if East Malling hadn't been quite as happy to give away their M9 rootstock to the rest of the world, you'd have had a huge competitive advantage. I mean, the rest of the world wouldn't have been able to compete with English apples.
The UK would have had a very strong lead, but it's a shame, as you say, it wasn't painted it, because it'd be worth a considerable amount of money. Billions, I would have thought, because it's planted the M9 rootstock in every country all over the world that grows apples.
In so many ways, this is the dream orchard the scientists at East Malling were working towards, using our own M9 rootstocks and the state-of-the-art storage technology they pioneered. But there are some things that are distinctly un-British. The varieties they grow most of are Gala and Braeburn from New Zealand.
How do they determine what's worth picking and what's not worth picking?
We're looking for our optimum size on this Braeburn is 65 to 80 millimetre. That's diameter size, so that's, you know, what the customer wants, that's what the consumer wants, that's what we need to grow. And this is lots of one of my favourite apples to grow also. In the UK, it tastes totally different to the Italian and the French Braeburn. It is a dense apple. It's much, much better flavour. It's a combination of the sugars and the acidity that make it better. Today's 15th of October. This can come out of store middle of next May and come out exactly the same condition, firmness-wise, but develop the flavour.
How do you feel about the future of the English apple? Is it secure, or should we be worried about where it's headed?
I think the future for UK apple production is looking rosy. I think the UK could get up to 35% produced homegrown, and the public definitely want UK apples.
It's great to think of a resurgence in the British apple industry. And yes, these are English apples, although technically they're not English varieties. This is Braeburn and Gala from New Zealand originally, although strangely they grow better in our climate than they do back at home. And if it's these varieties that have to be planted in our orchards in order to make them commercially viable, well, so be it. But you know what I really crave are the exquisite flavours and textures of those much-loved Victorian varieties. My favourite childhood apple is on the slab at East Malling for an identity test. The scientists are as rigorous and forward-thinking in their approach as ever. They've extracted the DNA data of 2,000 apples archived at the National Fruit Collection, preserving genetic diversity for the future. I'm hoping my apple will produce a match.
And what we're going to do is filter these data by each of the scores that we gave your apple, and hopefully there'll be one other entry in the database that matches perfectly with yours. Okay, so at the first locus, your apple has a size of 96, so we'll filter for 96. At the second allele at that locus for yours is 106, so there's been a 10 nucleotide, a 10 ATCG mutation.
Okay.
So we'll filter by that.
I'm nodding as though I understand all of this, obviously.
So now we've limited the data set to only those apples that contain these two alleles at the first locus.
And it's still a surprising amount. I mean, there's still, well, a full screen full.
Sure. The probability of finding a unique apple at a single locus is very, very low. But at 12 loci, the probability increases, so there's a very high chance that if we have your apple in the database, then we'll have a single match with your apple. So the next locus, filter by 88, and now you see there's only 20 now, which could be your apple. Okay. So already we're on the right track to finding it.
But look at some of the names of those. I mean, there's some really unusual things there.
Yeah, these
Green
are
custard.
These
Newton
are not.
Wonder is in there as well.
Newton Wonder, yep. We've got green custard, Nouvelle Europe. These are very old cultivars, a lot of these.
And Duke of Gloucester as well, which is just down the road from where the apple was growing. Brown Snout is an interesting one too.
Yeah, they've got some wonderful names. So now we'll filter by 113. And there you go. Your unknown apple is Keswick Codling.
Wow, that's extraordinary. But I mean, the details of Keswick Codling there, it's season, it's harvesting from September to October. I remember going at the end of my summer holidays, which fits perfectly because that apple was then just coming in to ripeness, which is why it tasted so refreshing and so sharp.
Yeah.
But the date is slightly odd, 1793, and it's from, I mean, the Keswick Codling, it's from Keswick. So what is it doing growing in Gloucestershire? It must have been a really well-respected apple to have travelled from Keswick down into the middle of Gloucestershire that early on. That's incredible.
Well, I'm glad we could help you solve the mystery of your apple.
32 years of mystery solved by the click of a button. That's fantastic. Can you open the gate for me? Push.
And a carefully grafted Keswick Codling will be taking pride of place in my garden.
Look at those roots.
I got some, Daddy.
Oh, well done.
There's no doubt that the British contribution to the apple is unparalleled. On one hand, we have the diversity of varieties supplied largely by the Victorians, and on the other it's about pure science and industry. The scientists of Eastmoreland who catapulted the apple into the 20th century, like it or not, making it what it is today.
I think that apple is planted.
I think it is planted.
And the challenge for the future is combining those two disparate elements. If the Keswick Codling, the Pitmaston, the Worcester, and all manner of heritage varieties are to persist, the responsibility of becoming custodians and guardians rests largely with us.
Still to come this evening here on BBC4, Michael Wood continues the story of India with a saucy take on the subcontinent in just a moment. At 9, the Big O is back in Britain with a Legend series profile of Roy Orbison. And then we've some European drama for you at 10 with Italian horror, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Stay with us.